So, just as we applied social identity theory to understanding systematic sexism, we can also apply it to understand systemic racism. And the same disclaimers apply. First of all, that systemic racism is such a vast, complex, multifaceted phenomenon that of course you can't capture it in its entirety just through the framework of social identity theory. However, it's still illustrative and still illuminative to do so. It's still helpful. And even though on Polymath I do generally like approaching these kind of questions from lots of different angles, I'd rather approach a big question from one angle than potentially not approach that question at all. Because this is still a really important topic in society. And again, I don't want to tell you how to think. You can come away from this video not even thinking that systemic racism is real. However, what I just want to do is sort of establish two key premises, two indisputable premises, which are that white people throughout society have historically monopolized power, and that groups who monopolize power get to define the norms of a society. Those are two indisputable psychological principles. But again, here's the thing. If you're just watching this clip now, it's much more difficult for me to prove that to you, because although in Polymath, all these clips, like, you can kind of understand them on their own, these clips are best understood with the context. And if I'm trying to explain systematic racism to you in the context of this theory and the sort of rich, deep, manifold psychological and sociological processes that underlie that, if you're just watching this clip and you don't know about those processes, if you haven't given me the chance to explain it to you, then if you don't already believe that systemic racism is a thing, it's less likely to convince you, because you don't know the mechanisms of what all I'm talking about. So all of this might seem to you as just idle talk, rather than things which are based on empirical evidence and models of how the human mind works and how human societies work as a consequence of that. So if you are just watching this clip in isolation, I would recommend watching the remainder of the episode, but you don't need to do that. It's still comprehensible by itself, and we're still going to be explaining this thoroughly. So with those sort of caveats in mind, these two premises which are sort of indisputable, white people in Western society, that is, have monopolized power throughout history for generations. Now that monopoly is starting to fade now, but the point is that these norms are, to quote Leonard Woolf, the dead hand of history. They are given to us by previous generations. They are inherited from history. And as we'll see with empirical evidence and recent studies from the 2010s, those haven't gone away. Those norms which have been created by the historical process haven't gone away. So that historical monopolization of power by white people in society is still relevant to us today. Premise 2, dominant groups in a society get to define its norms. So, just as we talk about with women, if you look at Western history throughout its very origin up until very, very recently, all of its executives, so all of its heads of state, heads of government, heads of businesses, were all men. All its bureaucracies, were all white. All the people running the country, all the people administering and governing the country were all white. All these scholars and intellectuals and the philosophers were all white. All the people actually contributing to public life and intellectual life, all the people actually forming the norms of society were all white. And crucially, all the soldiers and all their commanders were all white. So there's a monopoly of actual coercive force in society held by this one particular group. And again, that really, really matters. And again, we explore that more in episode 22. How a dominant group holding coercive power gets to play a huge role in shaping the sort of values and norms of that society. So for example, how in the vast majority of history, in state societies, a narrow elite has monopolized power regarding over 95% of the population, and they use that power to normalize deference to authority and loyalty as greater ethical concerns than mere happiness or suffering and mitigation of harm. So for the vast majority of human history, people conceive morality less in terms of happiness and suffering and more in terms of obedience versus disobedience. That seems like a really sweeping statement. We explore that more in episode 20. I'm just really mindful of repeating myself here, because if you're not watching this as a clip in isolation, I've already said all this stuff. So I'm not going into more detail, because even though there's a chance that you, as someone just viewing this clip in isolation, might not be getting the full context, if I go over it again and again and again, it's just a bit of a ball ache for the people who've been listening from the beginning. So, sorry. But again, all these actual positions of power have been held by white people throughout history. So they've been the dominant group in society, and been able to define the norms of that society. They've been able to define what it means not only to be Western, but what different the sort of characteristics associated with different ethnic groups have been set by the dominant ethnic group. So a great example of this actually is in the 1800s, when conceptions of whiteness were very different to what they are now. Because nowadays, you would conceive Italians or Irish people as white, because their skin color is literally white. But what you misunderstand with that assumption is that for the vast majority, in the 1800s and the 1700s and for much of the 1900s, whiteness was not an ethnic construct, it was a racial construct. The difference is that ethnicity is a biological phenomenon and race is a social phenomenon. It's the social roles and norms attached to certain ethnic groups. So Irish people weren't seen as white in the 1800s because whiteness was explicitly conceptualized as being biologically superior. It was conceptualized in terms of supremacy. It was conceptualized in terms of hierarchy. And unsurprisingly, in the UK, for example, the dominant ethnic group, which were Anglo-Saxons, conceived themselves as being superior to Irish people or Mediterranean people, or certainly Asian people or Indian people or Japanese people or African people, etc., 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 etc. And again, all this is predicted by social identity theory in terms of optimal distinctiveness. People want to identify to a social group which is as superior to other social groups as possible. So if they can, they will define the norms of all these social groups to be one that benefits their group the most and reserves positive characteristics for their own personal group. So for example, in Western society, what it means to be just as how Simone de Beauvoir pointed out that femininity was established as a foil to masculinity, whereas all the positive concepts associated with masculinity were mirrored in the inverse with femininity, the same goes for being Western versus non-Western. Throughout Western history, non-Western ethnic groups, for example, Chinese people or Indian people or African people or Native American people, have been characterized and conceptualized as being lazy, suspicious, or gullible, or kind of mysterious or sensual, but sort of irrational, more kind of emotion-based, weak and barbaric. And this has been kind of replicated in media again and again and again and again and again. So TV shows, movies, books, throughout Western history, and really lasting until the 1900s, and you still see evidence of this in shows from the 1900s, have all reinforced these stereotypes. Even, for example, in shows in the late 1900s, like in the 80s and the 90s, all the cast will be Western, they'll all be white, and there'll be some non-Western character who immediately conforms to this stereotype, who is immediately presented in this way. So again, what's happening is the dominant group in society has established what it means, has reserved positive characteristics for their own group, being Western. But they've also, they define the norms of their own in-group in terms of this antithesis to this non-Western stereotype. Westerners have defined themselves as being hardworking, fair, wise, open, honest, capable, civilized, rational. And this kind of presentation of Western groups as having all these positive characteristics and non-Western groups as having all these negative characteristics has been propagated not just in media, but also in science. For example, Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s, the kind of famous father of taxonomy, actually hierarchized human beings in terms of 4 distinct subspecies. White people, Asian people, Native American people, and black people, as having distinct evolutionary origins and representing distinct rungs on the sort of ladder of evolution. And also, in 1800s, popular science reflected this. So the science that pervaded Western society explicitly conceptualized Anglo-Saxons as being biologically superior to other races and ethnic groups, including other white ethnic groups. But Western popular thought in the 1800s hierarchized different ethnic groups in a hierarchy such that they were always, so Anglo-Saxons, i.e. the dominant group in Western society, were always at the top. Again, this is predicted by social identity theory, by optimal distinctiveness, and by the inherent human need for status. Anglo-Saxons, being the dominant group in Western society, conceptualized themselves as having all these positive norms and being associated with a sort of Protestant values and the Protestant work ethic, which Max Weber famously pegged is the wrong word, attributed Western industrialization and capitalism and modern society to this Protestant work ethic, which is specific to Northern Europe. So academic scholarship, as well as basic media distributed to all levels of society, reinformed race and ethnicity in the West as being sort of this hierarchical group where non-Westerners were constructed as this sort of foil to being Westerners. So Edward Said talks about this, by the way. He's a political sort of thinker who applies social identity theory to sort of race and a little bit more. So just how in sexism, the out-group was women, and the negative norms focused around femininity, in racism, the outgroup in Western society has been non-Westerners, and the various norms are sort of given different non-Western groups various stereotypes. It's also worth mentioning, racism and imperialism and colonialism are not exclusive to the West. They've been practiced by many different populations. The Japanese were deeply imperialist, the ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Turks in Turkey committed genocide against Armenia, the Maori committed genocide against the Moriori, the Inuits, hunter-gatherers in the north, practiced brutal forms of warfare that were near genocidal. For example, traders in West African states who were trading with European slavers willingly gave their populations over as slaves. So during the whole the transatlantic trade, Europeans would regularly raid the West African coast for slaves and gather them illegally, but they would also be traded to them in exchange for guns or textiles or whatever by West African chiefs and leaders as like a commodity. So again, racism and dehumanization and outgroup thinking are human constructs. They're not Western constructs. But in this example, we're exploring racism in Western society. Racism is also prevalent in many other societies. In fact, if you poll people about their attitudes to racism, it's more prevalent nowadays outside the West than within the West. But it's still prevalent within the West. Systemic discrimination on the basis of race still exists in the West because, as we talked about with the example of women, so in the late 1960s, the legal inequality between non-Western ethnic groups, so for example black people, and Western ethnic groups, for example white people, was broken down. However, that does not translate into cultural equality. Those norms, which have been accumulated by generations and generations and generations, still persist and still enforce a cultural inequality, wherein black people in everyday life are treated differently to white people. We're going to explore that empirically in some studies in just a moment, but I just want to make the point, the reason why this becomes structural, why it becomes systematic, is because A, institutions are made up of people. The police, the law courts, the social security agencies, healthcare agencies, these are all made of people. And these people, these human beings, are subject to the norms of developing society. They've still grown up in an environment where they have certain schemas for different ethnic groups. They have a schema for, say, Westerners and Anglo-Saxons, and a schemas for, say, Africans or Indians. And they will have different stereotypes and different agglomerations of beliefs and norms and sort of associations with these different ethnic groups. And again, we'll see that in the future in some other studies. But also, so these institutions are all staffed by these kinds of people. But also, these norms lead, for example, to the quality of black education, for example. So, for example, fewer black people in the Western society have private education, for example, than white people do in Western society. And often, if you actually examine rates of secondary or tertiary education for white people and black people, you see deep inequities in society, less so now, but certainly so historically. But what that basically means is that if individuals in a marginalized group are not educated, if they're not sent out into the workplace in high-level positions, if they're not educated to the point where they can become scholars or thinkers or philosophers or writers, if they can't actually get out there and meet people and contribute to the world, if they are kept up in ghettos, as for example they were deliberately done so in the USA. So in the USA in the late 1800s passed vagrancy laws where black people outside ghettos could just be arrested and sent to prison and made to engage in slave labor in prison as a result of just simply being outside their ghetto without the permission of a white person or without business involving a white person. What all that does is reinforce separation of black society from the rest of the general Western society. And even though that's less of a thing now, there are still areas in Western cities which are predominantly poorer and populated by individuals of color. And that's a legacy of the fact that historically, black people in Western societies have had much less access to high-paying jobs and skilled labor and middle-class positions and executive positions than other socio-economic groups. And that gives them less power to actually contribute to the changing of norms in society. It also contributes to the fact that black people, for example, in the USA, or in Western societies in general really, tend to be poorer than native Westerners, because historically they were denied the right to higher educational and employment positions. So for example, in the USA in the early 1900s, black people were almost exclusively sharecroppers, so farm workers or domestic servants. During World War I, so many white Americans had to go overseas that for the first time ever, black people were given jobs in factories. This caused a summer known as Red Summer, and I think about 1917. This summer of massive waves of lynchings and violence against black people, because white people were angry that black people had been able to ascend a rung in the socio-economic hierarchy. All this is to say that this maintains the position of non-Westerners as marginalized groups in society who don't have the economic or educational ability to change the norms of society and to try and change their position. And this is how all this discrimination becomes systemic and structural. It seeps into the institutions of society and becomes really resistant to change, because those same institutions reinforce the subjugation of the marginalized group and therefore reinforce the norms that have been created. Because again, remember, human beings have loads of different biases. For example, confirmation bias. If you're a racist white person in the USA and you think black people are unintelligent, and you go to an extremely economically deprived area where the quality of education is extremely low, and you get into a debate with a black person, you find that they're not as eloquent and articulate as you because they haven't had the same educational opportunities that you had, all that just confirms your own bias. These norms get confirmed by the fact that they've already existed. You get positive feedback loops. And we've already talked about stereotype threat, which is when individuals are made aware of the negative aspects of their stereotype, they tend to unconsciously conform to it. So for example, when black people are made to play a laboratory experiment where they play golf, and they're reminded that white people are typically seen as having a higher sporting intelligence than black people, they do worse than otherwise. That is the concept of stereotype threat. The mere awareness of your stereotype can help confirm that stereotype in the eyes of other people. There's also things we talk about, such as the Pygmalion effect, where individuals tend to unconsciously live up to the expectations of others and tend to adjust their behavior to live up to the expectation of others. And then of course there's a snowball effect, where if individuals treat you a certain way or treat you with a certain stereotype in mind, that tends to become more self-fulfilling. For example, if a teacher believes that a student is going to do really well, they'll treat them in such a way. So even if they're led to believe that a student's destined to do really well in class for no reason, they'll still treat them in such a way that facilitates that, because they'll give them extra attention, extra smiles, extra encouragement, etc., etc., etc. And the point is that these norms, the norms that are created as a result of that still exist. So let's talk about some studies. So a study in 2016 showed that black students are more likely to be expelled from school than white students, as a result of white students being perceived as more compliant. A study in 2016 by Bonham et al. Said that white homeowners were perceived as cleaner or more responsible than black homeowners, and that led to changes in actual perceived property value. Another study by Munger in 2017, the sanctioning of racial... So, that's actually, the Munger study is really interesting because there's lots of racism online, and it was found that if you get a bot to reply to racist people and basically call them out for it, they respond very differently based on whether it's a white person calling them out or a black person calling them out. And if a white person calls a racist white person out, they're much more likely to admit culpability and try and change. So, healthcare is a really, really big example where this structural discrimination, this structural racism, as a result of norms constructed in society a long time ago, still persist. So, for example, people of color in the USA, for example, have lower life expectancy and high blood pressure than white people, for example. They're more likely to suffer from chronic disease than white people of the same age. Black children are less likely to be classified as requiring emergency care than white children. Also, until very recently, doctors were only taught about skin conditions in the context of white skin. So they weren't ever taught what real skin conditions were made to look like on black skin. So that leads to massive misdiagnoses. Even in research, black medical students and the general population both tend to underestimate the amount of pain that black people feel in comparison to white people. They also, so when they're asked about why, it's because these individuals hold false beliefs that black people have literally thicker skin or have less sensitive pain receptors, for example. So, but as a result of this, black Americans are less likely to be prescribed pain medication when reporting pain to a doctor, as revealed by a study in 2013. So, all of this is to say that even in the 2010s, the cultural inequality between black people and white people still persists. These norms still persist. Even though these medical students, who are likely to rate black people as having less sensitive pain receptors than white people, complete myth by the way, even though these individuals probably would have explicitly rejected racism, as a result of the norms that have built up in society and by the internalization of norms by members of society, that still leads to genuine differences in how black people and white people are treated. And that leads to genuine differences in the sort of harm and happiness inflicted on both of these groups respectively. So again, you can change the laws of a society. So in the late 1960s in the Western world, racial discrimination was banned in official law. However, I mean, it still occurs in CVs, for example. So there have been experiments where CVs have been sent to employers, and I think people with non-Western names, I think African names, or might just be non-Western names in general, were 45% as likely to gain a callback than people with English names, even though like the CVs were exactly identical. And this was a recent study done, by the way. So the point is that these norms still persist. You can change the legal system, but changing norms is a much, much more different process. And in order to change norms, you have to do things which violate people's schema of non-Westerners as lazy or weak or insufficient or irrational or unintelligent. You have to actually do things like getting them into high-level positions in workplaces. You have to focus on education of marginalized groups. You have to represent marginalized groups such as non-Westerners, such as black people, in media as being intelligent, resourceful, kind, sensitive people. It's not enough just to change the law. You have to change the culture. You have to change the schemas that people have in their heads. You have to change how Westernness and non-Westernness is in fact perceived. Now, you might politically oppose things like diversity quotas. That's fine. I'm not telling you how to think. The point is just that without policies similar to that, it's much, much more difficult to change the norms of society. Because if you actually want to make life better for marginalized groups, it's not enough just to remove legal barriers to do so. You have to actually change the way that people think and the way that people act. And that is a much, much more subtle process. I mean, and also the fact that in the 1800s, for example, the dehumanization of black people was so colossally vast that the fact that black people are still infrahumanized in society today, for example, seen as less intelligent, or seen as having less sensitivity to pain, or seen as being less employable, that's less surprising when you consider the massive degree of dehumanization of black people in the 1800s. So if you look at bills of sale of slaves in the 1800s, for example, they literally describe male black people as bulls, female black people as cows, and black children as calves. Like, they literally use animalistic terms. And also in the 1830s until the sort of American Civil War, so for the mid-1800s in the American South, slavery was not even seen as a necessary evil. It was seen as a positive good. It was justified in society as an inherently good thing there. And I mean, the history of slavery in America is really a whole nother episode, as is the American Civil War and the roots of the American Civil War. That's really a whole nother episode. In fact, I think I want to do an episode about the American Civil War at some point. But the point is, for the American Civil War, like, it was slavery. The root cause of the American Civil War was slavery. It was other causes as well. It wasn't just slavery, but undoubtedly the most major cause of that was slavery. And not only that, slavery and attitudes towards slavery and conflict between different groups' attitudes towards slavery. For example, the Northern America and Southern America. That not only was really relevant to the American Civil War, but it really defines the trajectory and the actions of a US history. So just to give one example, the reason why Texas is one massive state rather than 5 smaller states is because Northern Americans didn't want 5 new slave-owning states entering the Union and therefore wielding extra senators in the Senate. That's just one example. But the point is, all this stuff really, really mattered. The degree of dehumanization of black people in the 1800s was vast. Although it's worth noting that even in the USA, Northern abolitionists or British abolitionists still didn't believe that the races were actually equal. They still would have agreed with these norms characterizing non-Westerners as a kind of psychological foil to Westerners. It's just they didn't believe and they didn't support actual genuine slavery. So, another thing, just as when I talked about social identity theory in the context of sexism and systemic discrimination and how modern feminism seeks to remedy that, the idea of anti-racism in modern society really is about all these norms. Anti-racism basically says it's not enough just to not be racist. You have to not only call out racism when you see it, but ideally try and understand these norms. Try and understand how racism permeates society and how racism affects its norms. And we can see with empirical evidence, with the studies I've just described, it does permeate societies and it does affect their norms. even in the 2010s, despite the fact that decades ago, black people were given equal civil rights to white people in Western societies. So the idea of anti-racism, it's not the same thing. And again, there may be individuals who are racist towards white people under the banner of so-called anti-racism, but that's not what anti-racism as an actual concept is about. Because remember, anyone can do anything in the name of an idea. For example, Stalin can create a communist regime in the name of Karl Marx and then create three explicit social classes. This is a massive tangent, but it's just the fact that Stalin openly admitted to having created a new class system and that he was okay with that and that it was a good thing, which is the exact opposite of everything Marx would have wanted. Or Lenin, for example. So Marx was all about democracy. And I know that this is irrelevant, and I know that you might also be thinking, this guy is a communist, so maybe he's got some kind of agenda to push. I'm not a communist, and I don't have an agenda to push. All I want to do is give you actual facts. What you choose to do with these facts is up to you. Whether you believe in systemic racism is up to you. I can't tell you what to think. I don't want to tell you what to think. I just want to give you facts. I just want to tell you what social identity theory is. I want to tell you how it relates to the concept of race. And I want to tell you some empirical evidence validating this stuff. How you integrate that into your worldview is up to you. I'm just presenting statistics and different consensuses from experts in psychology and sociology. But to return to the Lenin example, so Marx was all about democracy. Lenin held one election, lost, never held an election again, and established a secret police. The point that I'm trying to say is that while both Lenin and Stalin called themselves Marxists, in practice, they were doing the exact opposite of what was required by it. Similarly, anti-racism is not the endorsement of racism towards white people. However, you will find innumerable examples online of people who are racist to white people doing so in the name of anti-racism. That does not define what the ideology is. Anti-racism is just the opposition to all forms of racism, and it refers to actively educating yourself on the role that racism plays in society, and the role that institutionalized and systemic racism plays in society. And the whole thing of institutionalized and systemic racism is what I've just been talking about, of how the institutions of society are permeated with individuals with certain norms on what it means to be Western or what it means to be not Western, so including black people, for example. And it's the fact that this is all very self-perpetuating. If you have a marginalized group which, due to the institutions of society, is denied access to education or employment, then that all self-perpetuates. And there are also psychological reasons such as confirmation bias, the Pygmalion effect, stereotype threat, and the snowball effect, which sort of explains why all this becomes self-perpetuating. And anti-racism simply asks that you be aware of that, and as a result of making yourself aware of it, that helps stop it. Because remember, you are also a member of society. So if you are in an institution and you are actively aware of how these norms subconsciously affect you, so how employers, even if they're not actually explicitly racist, may still be less likely to hire a black person than a white person, as evidenced by that study of how only 45% as many CVs with non-Western names were accepted compared to CVs with English or rather Anglo-Saxon names. If you're an individual within an institution who is aware of that and who calls out racism when you see it and who tries to raise awareness of that concept, you are part of the solution. You are doing the right thing. You are helping. You are making a difference. You are helping to reduce the total burden of suffering extant in society that is inflicted by racism. That is what the whole point of anti-racism is. And you can go online and you will find many political partisans who will tell you a very different story about what anti-racism is. And they are doing so because they have decided that they don't like it for whatever reason, or they disagree with the fact that the norms of what it means to be Western versus not Western should be changed. That's behind a lot of this stuff, I suspect. Even individuals who don't identify as explicitly racist will still hold and endorse those norms. Similarly, when it comes to sexism, even individuals who call themselves feminists or who explicitly condone sexism, when given a scale, such as the benevolent sexism scale, they will still endorse traditional norms of femininity, such as being passive and restricted to the home, and restricted to caring professions such as teaching or nursing. So, yes, anyway, just be careful of who you listen to online. And I'm aware that I'm also biased as well. And I want you to be aware of that, actually, because I don't want to, force feed information and perspective down your throat. I want this YouTube channel to be a place which encourages you to think critically. I want you to think. I don't want to force feed an ideology down your throat. But part of thinking critically and thinking independently is being wary of other people who do want to force feed ideologies down your throat. And when you look at right-wing political thinkers online, I mean, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, but there's a ton of them, you know. These individuals are not going to tell you that they are biased, that they want you to think critically, because they are trying to get you to think a certain way. And I just want you as a consumer and as a person who is not immune to propaganda to be wary of that. That's all. So, and again, I know that we've just looked at systemic discrimination from the perspective of SIT, of social identity theory, but I still think it's an important topic to discuss. And I'm still glad that we're talking about systemic discrimination because it is an important topic within society. And that concludes episode 25. This, I think, is going to be potentially the longest episode yet. So, if you've made it to the end, if you've watched this whole vast episode, I mean, I don't know what to say. I'm extremely honored by the attention and the time and the effort that you've given me. But even if you haven't, even if you're just tuning now, I'm still honored. I'm still flattered. I'm still really pleased to be able to... I just want to inform people. I want to tell people facts. And what they do with those facts is fine. But there's a lot of... I say ignorance in society. That's not me calling you ignorant or implying that it's your fault. It's just with so many different sources of information in society, and so many of them being bullshit, and so many of them being wildly biased, such as Fox News, for example. I mean, again, there are left-wing political outlets which are also biased. It's just Fox News is particularly bad, for example. I think that Fox News actually ran a headline that said, "The left hate you and your baby." And in my view, if you're going to make any statement like that, the left hate you and your baby, or even the right hate you and your baby, you cease to be valid as an objective news source. Like, that's just so clearly disgraceful political partisanship. What was the point that I was making? I actually forget. I don't remember. I forget the train of thought that I was going on. So, hopefully I got far enough to make my point adequately. But yes, I think it's a very important topic. Yes, ignorance in society. Yes, there's lots of bullshit out there. And what I want to do with polymath is to just try and remedy it. I just want to be a source of real scientific information. That's what I want to do. Because although science can be conducted in a biased way as well, it's the closest thing we have to unbiased knowledge. Scientific information, empirical evidence that is peer-reviewed and conducted to certain rigorous standards is the closest way that we can get to objectivity. So I just want to promote awareness of that. I just want to give people facts. I just want to impart some kind of knowledge. I think that's inherently valuable, and I'm really glad to do it. And even if you're just watching this for just a couple minutes even, I see the imparting of scientific knowledge as a good thing, and I'm really pleased to be able to do it. So, with that said, you can see that it's gotten dark now. Actually, we've been doing this for a fucking while. Admittedly, I did, in between, so before we go on to the part about systemic discrimination, so that was actually yesterday. So this is the next day. You can see that I've shaved, actually. So just in case like you were wondering, like, oh shit, did like the lighting switch up or something? No, I did just shave beforehand. Still need to get a haircut. So I'm gonna get a haircut like next weekend. So you might see me in a future episode with like a little fresh skin fade, you know. That's the plan. Anyway, unless the hairdresser is fully booked, in which case I'm fucking cooked because I haven't had a good haircut in like 3 months. But anyway, thank you very much for listening. I am very, very grateful for you and your time. I should probably look at the camera, shouldn't I? Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.